Welcome to Pure Signal, where we cut through the noise to bring you what matters in technology. I'm Vincent Yates, the Global Chief Data Scientist and your data guy. I've been the head of data science at Uber, the chief data scientist at GE, at Zillow, at Microsoft, and I'm here to bring you the data and AI perspective in our conversation. Joining me as always, Jason Goff, our Global CTO here at Credera. He's our systems architecture and implementation expert, and our newest member of our regular hosts, Kevin Erickson, our North America CEO and our business strategy expert. Between us, we've built mission critical systems at the top 60 of Fortune 100. We're here to filter through what's going on in the world of technology, the development through the lenses of data, systems thinking, and strategy to help you unlock the actionable insights for your business. With that, let's get into it. So as you guys know, I drink a lot of Starbucks.
Yeah, really.
You knew this already?
So Vincent got the Starbucks email where it says like, "Hey, you're in the top 2% of or 5% customer, top 1% of customers." He was in the top 0.0% because he was a rounding. Like they didn't account for someone being in the top 0.001% of their customers.
Yeah, that is actually, it's true. Yeah.
I also heard that he was in all three of the last CEO searches because they
Yeah,
took their
exactly.
top highest degree and highest consumer basis and stuff. They would be the perfect CEO.
Who are the top 5 people that bought Starbucks?
Yeah.
I'm in that list. Yeah. It's funny, I obviously I clearly visit Starbucks a lot. Those are all true. The thing that's fascinating to me is when I walk into the Starbucks by my house in particular, or the one here by the office. Yeah, walk, drive. Okay, drive in. Yeah, fair. The baristas know me. I mean, not all of them, certainly. There's turnover there, but several of them, they just kind of know me. Like, oh, hey, Vincent, how are you? Your drink, making it right now. And, that's this really nice personalized experience. And I think that's kind of what they're trying to bring back broadly for everybody is this sort of writing on the cop, that mentality. The interesting thing is, there's something very endearing about that. There's something very comforting about that. They know me. They know who I am. They know what I like. They know how I behave. They have conversations. They know that I travel, whatever. That's just like a great experience. Imagine that same experience though, where every time you had to re-explain everything. That really is the world we live in with generative AI today. I think that if you look at the landscape, I mean, you hear crazy numbers of 800 million users, the fastest to a billion users is going to be one of these AI tools. You talk about that, $228 billion in infrastructure this year alone that's being invested. These numbers are staggering. What's really coming across, there's really 3 layers that most people are playing in. You have the compute layer, that foundational layer, where there's really just a few players. I mean, that's not where most businesses compete. Then you have the middle layer, which I want to talk a lot about today, is the context, like what's the information it knows. And then you have that top layer, which is really the control layer. How do you integrate it into the workflows and the processes that you have holistically within your business? But to me, again, the compute is a few people, great. The context is the most important part. This is the ability for these models to be the barista that knows me. They know my name. They know what I like. They know my preferences. They know, do I want it to go or do I want it to stay? They know all of these things about me. And if I look at my own behavior on some of these tools, I see it coming through in actual tools. So for example, if you look at all the benchmarks today, Gemini is on the Pareto frontier. I mean, they are the best across virtually every dimension. When you look at the cost, the compute, and the actual performance, they are across all the model sizes. They are the best. And I like Gemini, and I use Gemini, and it's great. It's a great tool. And yet, I find myself most of the time using ChatGPT. And it's not because it's better. It's nice that it has a desktop app. I kind of like that, so I can hotkey and pull it up right away. But it's actually that it has all of that knowledge of who I am. Every query I've ever typed in there, it remembers and it uses in that information. It uses that information in the response to the query. And so what I want to talk about today is really that context layer. I think this is what's going to be the long-term differentiable moat for organizations. I mean, we're going to move from a world today where we're like the traveling salesman with all of our tools and we're carrying all of our information, every single tool. I have to provide the context. Who am I? Even prepping for this podcast, I'm like, here's the podcast, here's the audience, here's what we're trying to say. Now help me refine my script. Whereas with ChatGPT, I can just say, hey, I'm working on a podcast. It already knows all that. Just tell me the information. And recently, by the way, in fairness, Gemini did just release a new version that does have the context of all your previous searches. So they understand this too. So it's not meant to be a slight, but really an insight that data layer becomes the most important part. So, with that in mind, I want to talk about this idea that really this intelligence is not so much a function of how big the models are anymore, how much compute you have. I think the intelligence at this stage of the game is actually fundamentally predicated on what data does it have access to and how does it get access to that data. So, Jason, I'll kick it over to you just to start us off here. From a systems perspective, why is it so hard for AI to retain all that information, all that context, all that information that you've given it before across platforms? Like, what's going on here? This insight that I've provided is not that novel, I don't think. So, why don't people solve it?
Oh, it's not that easy to solve. I think in general, the way we design systems is largely to be stateless, right? To not remember things. Like, you go book airfare on an airline website and you go page to page to page to page. And, you think it's remembering where you're going. Doesn't really remember, but it's basically recreating that state every time you go in. And there's a reason for that, and that is scale. Let's say I have 100 servers. That state's pretty cheap. And if one machine dies, I can go to another one, it can recreate that,
Mm.
right? And so that's generally how we have designed systems for the last 20 years. Before that, they were quite stateful, but the last 20 years we've been really focused on these stateless architectures, and the AI models are no different. I mean, if you think about the model itself, imagine the model is a big model like Gemini has 70 billion numbers, right, in a matrix. It's a bunch of matrices with 70 billion numbers in, and it takes the data you input and multiplies it times all 96 of those matrices with 70 billion numbers, and it produces some output where you can't really change 96 matrices with 70 billion numbers in them for every single person that uses it, right? Like they train them on the data of the internet, or they use people experts to do reinforcement learning, but they tune these models. It takes months or years and millions of dollars. Well, you can't do that per person. And so, broadly speaking, you can either put that memory that you were talking about, know Vincent and his that he lives in Flower Mountain, he does this pod, and this is how his tone of voice. You can either put that in the model or not in the model, and provide it as input.
And when you say
So,
in the model, you're talking about like fine tuning the
like
model
in those
effectively.
numbers, those numbers are essentially incorporating the data on the internet and in textbooks and on YouTube. And so we can either incorporate all of that information about Vincent, which changes all the time, and about Kevin and about Jason and about everyone in the models. Well, that doesn't scale, right? Or we can have a little database about, like, this is Vincent and what he likes, and memory about the things he's chatted about and cared about, and we can provide that as input. And that's essentially what the models do, right? With this kind of long-term memory about you. For people that have used the tools, you can go in and you can give input like, I'm looking for, you know, the best coffee. I live here. What's the best rated coffee? Blah, blah, blah. And then it will give you an answer. Or you can just say, what's the best coffee without giving all that. That's the input. That is often called the context window. And that is the data that runs through the model. And so what these tools are actually doing is augmenting. They learn about you. They just save that data, right? They save that, you live in, you know, Texas, and that you like Starbucks. And when you go make a query, they just insert that into the input. Hey, remember, Vincent is here. He's here. He lives, likes these things. He does this. This is examples of his tone of voice. Now here's his question. And that is all provided as input into the models. So why doesn't that port across vendor? Well, because OpenAI has it, and Chat Gemini has a different copy.
Mhm.
And the challenge there is that the context window can only be so big. You can only provide so much input, right? And so it's an interesting question of if we want to have actual, what, I would call durable long-term memory. Like, is there another way? So right now, the way the models work, I don't know that it's super feasible I mean, it's possible. I don't know that it's feasible to put it in the model. We do it today through, essentially storing, vectorizing. We would say that information about you and adding it to the query, hidden. You don't see it, but it's just in your prompt. Like, is there another architecture that is going to have to be developed to support that durable memory as part of the model? And there's kind of some
Yes.
techno yeah.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, I think there will have to be some other. There's kind of that, there's the idea of the LoRa, which is a way to fine tune a model, which is kind of takes, I mentioned all of these different matrices, kind of takes the last one and lets you make changes to just the last one. Is there some technique like that is going to arise? I think that it probably has to. The context windows are getting bigger, but are they going to be big enough to store everything about you?
Sure.
I think it was, I think this is, I'm going to take us on a slight deviation. I'm going to go back to my favorite reread book from last fall, which was Isaacson's The Innovators, right? What's fascinating to me is someone who's understanding anything you just said was, is I look at 200 years of computer history going back to special purpose versus general purpose machines. Like we've seen this at every step of the evolution. You have 100 years from Ada into this to that, trying to answer this question. You go mainframe into this, answering this question. And memory and Intel in the 70s, 80s answering this question. Like it's always been the same thing. So what's interesting about this context is like, and necessarily, again, this is your world, it's not mine, is the AI models today special, general purpose, or special? Well, I guess in this case, they're really special purpose because they don't have any of the general information and how that plays out. And so we're going to absolutely have to figure this out. Now we can do it, but what's been interesting, it's every step of the evolution over 200 years has had to go through this in different ways. And it's just interesting going back to, again, you joke about the stuff that happened before your time at Georgia Tech, but, punch cards, all that stuff like that. And in some ways, in a very simplistic way, that's what our AI models are today. It's running the same thing over and over again and modeling, and we're going to have to figure out a way to add this in, whether it be what you just talked about there, doing that, how that fits in. I think it's also fascinating, the whole construct of what's decentralized versus centralized, what's edge computing. We're dancing around all the same problems. So I guess my question to both of you, because much smarter than me on these topics and most things in general in life, like what can we learn in this case from actually looking back at these different elements? Because I think that it does just seem like it's the next generation of the same problem. I love, why I love this topic is because it's so fun to me to see us going back and forth between, just going back to what, the early desktop stuff, those were, what was predicted that we saw in the 90s and the first aughts, that was predicted in the 60s and the 70s. So like, where are we going to go next? And, maybe it's the input, having the machine implanted in that's got the general purpose around that.
Yeah, I think, look, from my standpoint, I think that what you see consistently, and by the way, my favorite joke recently has been about, what did we call the places where we stored these computers back in the day? Data centers, not computer centers, but data centers. Because at the core of how business operates, it's the data. And so this core
Spoken from the
question,
data
exactly,
scientist.
yeah,
Yeah,
not self-serving at all. Don't worry. But I think this is the
yeah.
core question: is how do you actually share data? Because that becomes the important bit. What you do with it's important too, no doubt, but you have to have the data in order to have a sufficient answer. And so we've worked with lots of different ways of how do you share data across these systems. Now we have APIs that are sort of that contract layer to allow you to share data across those systems internally and externally. But I think there has to be another evolution of this because it doesn't seem practical to pipe the amount of data I need to have a good answer to every single API, every single call. So there must be some better way to do that. And I think that to me is, I think, the exploration of today is what would that look like broadly speaking? How do you have this portable, secure, encrypted data layer that you continue to enhance, but you can bring it from tool to tool to tool?
Yeah, and there's a lot of research on this. It's an even worse problem, I'll say, because it's not just all about you, right, or me, or our preferences or our information. But there's also, you mentioned like some of the APIs. Like, yeah, the APIs, they will, again, they will go out, make an API call, an MCP server or another agent, get data, but then they still do the same thing. They stuff it in the context window, that data in there, and eventually, what you're going to have is kind of a change in the core architecture of these models to allow for some of this different. There's a hierarchy of information, right? There's like static information. There are facts that are encoded in the models today. There's things about Vincent. But there's also things that change very rapidly. What's the temperature, right now? Like that's not something that you can necessarily encode. So there always had to be a way to encode facts that are long term and persistent. There'll be a way to encode personal things about you or about some company or about their products. And then there is like real time, I need real time data. And this kind of hierarchy of memory is, or information and data is kind of it's one of the big areas of research right now is exactly how and where do you plug those in, right? Like right now, they either get, like I said, they either get baked into the model or they get fed into the input. And so, will there be a new design where there are different points to use and collect these? Like again, that's a look. If I had the answer to that question, I would not be here. No offense, I'd be I'd
You'd be
call
on
up
more
Google.
stages than you've
I'd
been
call up
recently.
I'd call up Google and I'd
But it's an interesting element. I think, and let's use the simplistic terms that I think in. Like you're really around. We're gonna individuals now instead of having, hey, my behavior's being tracked or managed. It goes back into classic basic one-on-one programming. I have an input library, which is now me, and I'm pushing that in. So it seems like, yeah, I understand where I'd go in the model, but it seems very it is simplistically, there is going to be a file around me. It's going to be just a prompt that gets loaded when my session comes up of whatever I'm using, whatever AI model I'm using. But it seems like it's going to have that because there's no way you can store that anywhere, right? So it's going to have to come in like some type of scenario from there.
That's right. I was gonna say there's two things I think to your point calling out, Jason. And I think they're both options, and I think reality is probably to be some combination of both potentially. We talked previously about will there be one master model that we all leverage, and then provide a different context in that context window, or do we each have our own model that's been fine tuned on our actual behavior that we carry around with us? And my guess is probably some combination of both in sort of asymptopia, if you will, and the eventual state. In the short term, though, the cost of training these models is still so large. I can't imagine that we can actually have our own embeddings that are truly the model is built for us on our preferences. So it'll probably be a generalized model. And then we provide it our specific data that we then pour into the context window today. And to your point, the context window is limited, which is why I think you have to bring all of the data. So one of the things I did before Gemini had all of the features around your search features, I'd actually go to OpenAI's ChatGPT and I'd say, hey, summarize who I am in this context to answer questions around this vein. And so it would go take everything I have, it would then summarize that, nice clean summary, quite long, but good summary. And then I'd paste that into Gemini as the context and say, using this context, now answer this question because I thought Gemini was going to be better at answering that specific question. And so I can imagine a world where that works in sort of a more universal sense, but it's tedious and cumbersome. And I can imagine instead what will really happen is if I had all my data in the appropriate format, that'd be a new standard to your point, Jason, that new standard, I bring my data, I can provide it to the model in real time behind the scenes, invisible to me, the end user. But here's my data set. I've authenticated. Now you can leverage it through a RAG type, not literally RAG, but like a RAG implementation where it has all my information and then use that in the context of the actual question you have. And so my question to you, Jason Bradley, is like, if you were to imagine a world like that, what would it take technologically, not the full solution, but what are the elements of the solution it would take technologically from like authentication and encryption and just portability of it? How would that, do you have any ideas of what that might look like?
well, some. Before I answer that, though, I just want to make one quick caveat or a diversion. It's like we're having this whole discussion around a person's use of a tool. Like I'm
Sure.
using ChatGPT, I'm using Gemini. I think a lot of our listeners are, executives of companies, right, who are really looking to do, not a, end user using, a chat to be like, can I build an AI to, personalize the content on my website, right? Or, it's a much more, that top layer you're talking about. How do we integrate and actually call this? And I just want to make sure that we're clear that like this is relevant to those use cases as well, right? So like if you were to say like I want someone coming to my website, I want to know about them and provide them the best recommendation for the best restaurant or whatever without them having to go use an AI. Like it's still relevant that AI still has to figure out who you are and get that information in the context window. And so different ways to do that or different interfaces
Yeah.
into the models. But
It's a
I
good
just
call
want
out that just real quick. You're saying like effectively, even if you were just working on a website for an end consumer, in this world, you'd bring your own data. That end
yeah,
user would bring their data to your environment, and then you would do something with that to answer their question. But also just internally, I want to call out that too, which is like internally, if I'm prepping for this, or you're prepping for an earnings call, or you're prepping for a pitch with some other executive, I can imagine where I have my own database, and then Credera in this context has its own database conceptually. And in the context of our work environment, those two
right,
become one. And now my response is tailored both to the organization and to myself.
right. What that solution looks like. I think that probably I think, you know, most solutions that we come up with that work and work well are often just rehashed old solutions. And so this is a problem people have been trying to solve for a long time, which is distributed identity, distributed, and so single sign-on is a really good example. We for years it's like, well, I have a password here, I have a password there, I have a password there. How do we get it out so that I can password? There are solutions now. You see them all the time. Sign in with Google, right? There are Ping and Okta and these for enterprises, but and sign in with Facebook and sign in with Apple and these other things more in the consumer space. Like that seems to work with this kind of distributed. I need to move data around securely. In this case, my password and in some sense my profile, right? A little bit of profile data that can go in that. That can probably be extended leverage reused to get this. It does deal with a lot of the security. It was designed to deal with security. So, I think that's a really good first candidate as a way to move data around. But in your previous example, you still have the Credera database, right? Within the office that you have to do, and you still have the real time things you need to do, like what's the temperature, and again, how do the models evolve to make use of all of those? Like, do they have the right, input points to use all of those? Like, I think that's the $1 million question. I totally agree, that the data, you always point out like it's the data that you put in these things that is the most important. And I totally agree with that. But they do have to be designed to allow the right data to go into the right inputs. And that's where all the research is going into, because you can kind of forget the data as a problem, like just assuming that we have the right data in the right formats at the right times. Like, how do we get it incorporated? That's where most of the research is going. So,
Yeah, it's fair. But it calls out, it sort of begs the question, I guess, in some sense, that you do have to get the data. It does have to be in some
yeah,
format that everybody can leverage. And so part of your standard in your mind is there's a canonical standard that has to be developed such that we store all relevant information. And then we have to find a way to then make that available through something like a OAuth plus plus, if you will, that allows those people to use it. Is
but
that right?
I think that more, yes, but I think more the bigger question and the more the research is going towards more of like how do we consume it. Not that it's not important, but those are somewhat solved problems. Like there are plenty of good ideas on how to solve that,
Hmm.
and plenty of good implementations that have solved it. Now, MCP, A, OAuth, these kind of models. Now we'll get better ones, but like still, right now there's only one place to consume that, and it's like shove it all in the context window, and we don't. There isn't. a good sense, I don't think. And again, maybe there's probably a bunch of researchers at OpenAI and Google that do have, I don't have a good sense for, like, okay, if we can get that, how do we even consume it? And that's where I think that we have to really think through.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to talk a little bit about talk back to your opening point here around this is applicable to the people. Kevin, from your standpoint, why would these companies be investing so much into trying to solve these problems? That is to say, like, what are the implications to the consumer experience, the loyalty, et cetera, that this sort of personalized experience would justify us even wasting our time or spending any of it at all, frankly, on these kinds of problems? You have any intuition or thoughts about that?
Go back to loyalty, right? Well, before it's been, I have to have all that information. I have to be able to contain that. I have systems and all that stuff does that, managing that. In a future world where I'm choosing what to broadcast, again, it's going to be really interesting around how that plays out to where, that whole need to do that might go away where, that I choose where I go as a customer. I'm broadcasting that this is, my preference is this airline over that airline, this seat versus that. I think we all want window seats today, but like at the exit row, but how that plays out in terms of yeah, that's an interesting construct of like how do you actually attract new people? You can see a world right now where that would, if I already have my preferences, you with Starbucks, right? Like that's great. They don't need to track you because you're doing that for them. But how do you get new customers? How do you think through that? How do you attract customers? I don't have any great insights for you, but it's actually a really fun puzzle to think about in terms of what you'd look like that. It might end up becoming that, the offering. It's going to definitely change how advertising works and how you attract, the way that you bring people to your site, how you work through that, how you attract, and then really how do the models that learn enough about you to help direct you to where you want to go.
It's a very popular and idea that a lot of people espouse. I mean, it's the core of the basis of the Web3 movement, right? Is that
Right.
I have the data, not the company. I am
Of
somewhat
course.
skeptical of that future, not because it can't work technically or isn't a good idea. It's that the companies want the data and they're not going to, like everybody that, would be receiving it is going to want to keep it and store it. And, and there's no incentive for them to, this is back to the Web3 thing. This is the big problem with it. Like, go to a company and say, I want to build you a solution where you will have absolutely no idea who your customers are and all their data will be invisible to you. Like,
And in
They won't
how?
fairness,
be visible. They won't be visible because I choose to.
Yeah, but I'm
but
saying, and like they get to tell you what they want you to know, and you don't get to know anything else about them. And in a lot of cases, they're anonymous, and companies will say to you, "No, thank you."
so I agree with you conceptually, and I think this is why I'm trying to tease out the loyalty point in
Right.
particular. We've both talked to a specific company. Wouldn't it be great if you go to your local hardware store and they already knew which appliance you had or which color paint you would use for your bedroom or your bathroom? And you don't have to bring that to them. So there's an enormous amount of value and lock-in and loyalty that would be associated if they just had that information. They just kept it. They have it. They just don't keep it. That'd be amazing. To your point, I think organizations realize that value, and that's why you see OpenAI and Google making so much investment these days on having these personalized platforms
Mm-hmm.
that have all that proprietary memory and knowledge.
Even there's very simple ones that are great. Like Amazon Garage is one. Right? Like it,
Sure.
it knows you can. You have to put in your VIN, you have to fill it out, right? Like this is exactly all the details about my car. But then you can just go search and say like, I need windshield wiper blades, and it knows, right? That's not AI per se. Those current solutions are not using AI per se. It's just data that they. But like, does someone build these universal, all about me, or do I have my all of my data that I can then selectively allow different people to use in an AI native form, right?
Correct. That's right. And so, to your point, so I think organizations realize it. And we're seeing companies try and build moats around their tools. They capture all that data. I mean, but the early days of OpenAI, everybody thought they started out really far ahead and thought it was an insurmountable challenge for any competitor to get caught up because it would go the same way as search, which is once you get critical mass, you actually learn faster than any of your competitors can ever keep up, and you just keep moving along and you win. Turns out not to be true thus far. Thus far. As you bring this new intelligence with that data, I think it could be true. The counterpoint, by the way, to your argument that organizations would never sign up for a situation where they can sell products and not know who's buying them, not understand those customers at all. The counterpoint is the disintermediation that happened with virtually every CPG brand, thanks to Amazon, Walmart, Target, the big box stores. If you're Procter and Gamble, you have no idea who's buying your diapers. You don't know, even from a supply chain standpoint. I can tell you, because I used to be a client of mine, I can tell you they don't even know when Amazon's going to put their diapers on a promo. And yet their contracts say they must keep their warehouses, distribution centers adequately fulfilled so they can do their 2-day or 1-day delivery. So my counterpoint would be it's already happened. Now they're not happy about
Yeah,
it
that's what I
in
was
many
saying.
ways.
They're not looking to go. They're not
Well,
looking for another Amazon to.
I agree on
Well, they're looking for the committed volume from
that.
Amazon.
This is my point. I agree. That's not ideal, but it was a business decision that they continue to make. They could simply stop selling on these platforms. They have a choice. They don't have to go through these distribution channels they currently use. They could go DTC and say, that's it. We're making a strategic decision. It's going to be painful, but we think it's the right way to go. And they don't. So there is enough value there for them to believe that this is the right path forward. And by the way, don't forget, many even digital native DTC first direct-to-consumer, remember DTC, direct-to-consumer brands have eventually evolved to also be in-store, big box stores, Amazon, etc. So even if they started there, it seems there's enough value creation through these other channels that they're willing to give up all of that data, at least historically. And so I think this is
Yeah,
where,
but that's different. Going through a distributor, going through Target, where Target's going to buy, I'm at Harry's
yeah, sure.
razors and Target, and now Target's going to buy, 1 million units wholesale and put them on their shelves
Yep.
is different than I want to go direct to consumer and not know anything about those consumers.
But,
Yeah.
but what's interesting about this thread, though, is, and this is one of the things that we've talked before about, just at least one of my concerns about just the way the AI models do search versus others, is that it comes back with a definitive probabilistic answer. And you don't think anymore. Like, I don't think about I need a razor. Here's my condition. Well, this is what it is. I don't know if it's
Right.
Harry's, if it's Gillette, if it's with this brand, or even know who owns that. Right, the classical. Do you buy Kirkland or you buy the brand when it's 88% chance it's the same product.
From the same factory.
And it's like
white
and
label.
then that's what Amazon is doing too. And so it's changing. That's the part that's this interesting world that we're talking about. And I also just listening to this conversation this morning. Like, I mean, we're also coming from a very Western perspective. To where
Interesting.
where we have choice, right? You think about China, other locations, just think about different spots around the world. Yeah, it's possible that just having a centralized approach to all this. I mean, actually, some of these things lead you down this path, right? If I need a razor and I don't care what it is anymore, and knows based on my behaviors, here's the one that's the right one. Whether it's the right one or not, I don't even question it. So it's going to be really fascinating. Where does consumer choice come into it? Where does product information come into it? How do companies compete on this? Which is why I think why they go to Amazon as well. It's the dollars and it's the efficiency of that play. But you're exactly right. Like, I mean, do they know their customer, or do they just have to know the aggregate customers? This is what the product evolution is going to look like.
Yes.
It's actually, I mean, this is where I think it gets a bit scary in good and bad ways when I think about these themes from a customer perspective. I mean, you go back to your company, whether it be our company, how do we advise? You think about the ability to know what differentiates a service is really difficult. Or, I had experience this week with a potential client where we tried a gazillion different ways to be able to have a sit down and really discuss our offering and pricing. And they just didn't want to engage in that way, whether it's because they already made their choice, good or bad. But it was like really frustrating because I'm like, you're making a decision based on something you saw that is incomplete on what the options that are available to you, because you're not willing to actually engage in the conversation. And so obviously we have to work around that. But like, I think that's happening writ large in this space too. And this goes back to even, we know from behavioral science that people don't, what they think they want and what they really want are often the gap in that too, which is an area to be exploited either intentionally or not in this space as well. We are way all over the place this morning, but it's kind of
No, it's
interesting.
all in the same vein, I
But it's
think.
kind of
In my head,
interesting
it
to
all
see.
maps. That's right. Yeah. I think it's exactly this. These are the core questions that I think are worth wrestling with now because the lock-in hasn't happened yet. We haven't made these decisions, but customers, to your point, are going to these engines to solve this. I have a really funny anecdote. Just this week, I got tagged in a LinkedIn thing that kept saying like, "Oh, somebody mentioned an article, don't care." So and so responded to this article. Oh, so and so liked this article. And I was like, "What the heck is this thing?" So I ended up taking the bait and I clicked on it, fine, whatever. And it turns out that somebody did like a Gartner style ranking of consulting firms for AI specifically. And we ended up getting ranked. And I mean, fascinating because nobody ever reached out to us. I reached out to our markets like, hey, somebody, what's going on here? You know, we did very well. And that was nice. But like, is this something we did? Like, what's going on? Like, I don't know. We knew nothing about it. And so I had reached out to the people who did the ranking. I was like, "Hey, thanks for the ranking, appreciate it. I'm just curious, like, what data did you use? It seems mildly incomplete. I mean, we did well, so I'm not complaining, but it seemed kind of incomplete." And they said, "Oh, well, we just used basically a generative AI engine and asked it to go do the rankings for us, more or less." Was my impression. And I'm sure they had some other things. I don't mean to minimize what the work they did, but that was really the core of their analysis was using these tools. And so in some sense, I'm like, well, geez, I guess we as a firm, if to the extent that I care about how we're represented with AI, which of course I am, we need to be investing heavily in how this GEO space, this generative engine optimization, sort of SEO, right? I call it GEO. This GEO space treats us. While I recognize that I'm giving up the ability to track people on my website and know what articles they clicked on, where how far they scrolled, et cetera, I also know I have to meet the customer where they are. And so in that regard, I might be willing to give up the other information that I think would be quite helpful for us in order to get the distribution these engines ultimately offer. And in particular, if you imagine a world where, you know, you do your boat batter and you just buy what it says, you do your razors and you just buy what it says, and then eventually we get to a world where it just automatically orders for me. It truly is the agent acting on my behalf in this world. You may have no choice. And so I think this is why it's so interesting to me to talk about like what are the risks if OpenAI or Google are successful in building this proprietary data layer. One more example real quick. I use Otter AI a lot for meetings, etc. Create a transcription, and it drives me nuts because they make it so painful to extract the transcripts. And every time it sees you copying the transcript, it says, "Hey, I try Otter AI. You should just be doing that stuff here." And my point is like, I don't want to do it here. You guys aren't the core. Yeah, you aren't the core platform that I want to use for my generative bits. I want to use you for transcription. You're great at it. Summaries, notes, it's awesome. But I want to take this and I want to put it back into ChatGPT, for example, where it has all my other knowledge and then it grows my knowledge base over there. And they make it very difficult. They let you, but they make it very difficult. But this is the lock-in effect that I'm worried about is in a world where every bit of information that I'm inputting into the systems becomes incrementally more helpful for me and for the answers and for the engine itself. I really, as a consumer, I really want that stuff to be centralized and I don't want to deal with the sort of vendor lock-in. As a company, of course I want vendor lock-in. I want them to be stuck with me because now they have to. And so I guess, Jason, you know, it's I'm all over the place to your point a little bit with that question, but you know what we're seeing the moves happen. Google and OpenAI and Anthropic and others are making moves to build that layer, that memory platform, if you will. What are the risks? Like, what are the concerns with that, or is it all like this is just inevitable and it's worth it and just go for it? What do you
Well,
think?
I think it is. There's a there was a really good paper. I think it was Google that published it. Like it was like a year ago. Where essentially the analogy is like if you think about like a classical computer today, right? You have a CPU, right, which is again it's a general purpose, adder. It adds and multiple. It adds numbers and compares whether that number is equal to a zero, a one or a zero, right? And on top of that, you build software, right? And on top of that, and for that software, you can provide input in the form of data, right? That's I/O, and you have memory,
Mhm.
right? Short term and long term, durable and non durable memory that then the software can use to change, to schedule essentially schedule execution on that. And so the paper is really like, do these AI solutions evolve to where the models are just like a CPU? They're just execution engines, and there's some layer on top, the prompt, agent, instruction, whatever you want to call it, and then it has the ability to go get I/O, and has short and long term memory. I think that we're heading in that way just because it's so expensive to make the models, and the alternative would be to like have many smaller fine-tuned models for individual tasks, and maybe that has an analog in classical computing too, because there are things that you offload, math coprocessors, ASICs, those kind of things that for network traffic, and so maybe there's a combination of all of those things. So yeah, I think it is inevitable that that is the way that these things are trending,
Yeah.
and I don't know that there's any risks. I mean, it depends on what you mean by risk. There's risks to companies, I think, that don't keep up. Uh,
Well, I think one of the risks you already identified that I was thinking about was the idea that you don't know your users anymore.
yeah.
In a world where somebody else owns the context layer itself, you can build integrations, you can use the model, but you won't know who those people are.
Well, that it depends on again, it depends on how you do it, right? Like if you said, well, like I have my data, Credera has their data, and the AI is able to access both. If you have those type of different, short term, long term, different IO to different places in that paradigm, you'll still be able to get access to customer data if you need to.
But I don't.
It is only if you design it in such a way that there's no other way to get the data in other than through this kind of anonymized uh, input layer. But again,
But I think like my point on that, my question on that to you is there a world where everybody wants to have this sort of open, interconnected ecosystem as a company? Like in advertising, for example, sure they want to share data, and then nobody really wants to, and then they make up nonsense like clean rooms. It's not nonsense; it's actually helpful, but like that is their workaround to like, well, I don't want you having my data, and I don't want you having my, and so like, well, we'll kind of come up with this hybrid thing. The challenge that I think we will face in this new world that's not true in that marketing context is I need a more holistic picture of who you are from not one or two players. That's the clean rooms work if it's one or two players. If it's like the company and the platform on which they're leveraging, like the walled gardens of Meta, great, that's wonderful. But if I need the data from Otter and I need the data from my calendar and I need the data from my database, and I need the database or I need the data from this podcast, then you're talking about 15, 20 different sets of data to answer one question effectively. I don't know how that would work.
I don't view these as risks. I view these as design challenges. Like it has to be designed in a privacy protecting way, and it has to be scalable to handle all of these different things. Like the risk would be that we can't figure out a way to do those, right? And I don't. I mean, we'll figure out a way. They're smart guys in
Techno
Google
optimist here. Okay,
Yeah.
good. I
and
like it.
gals at
It's not,
Google,
that's
and
not usually that's my
Yeah,
role. That's
yeah,
not my
absolutely.
role. Yeah.
That's
But I
great.
think it's
Well,
well,
interesting
there's
around.
to Kevin's point. There's too much money at stake for them
Yeah.
not to figure it out.
Yeah. I think it's interesting around the whole construct of what's product differentiation, right? I think big companies, they spend a lot of money on the marketing and advertising side to be able to try to track that way. It is actually an optimistic view to be like, what if it really becomes about product differentiation, experience differentiation, and it goes back to companies invest into that layer versus in customer acquisition based on, and I think that a lot of people would benefit from that. Again, how that happens, what that looks like, how do we create customizable things? I mean, this is where it's kind of fun where it all kind of comes together. I mean, think about you've got on-demand advertising based on some data inputs. You've got single day fulfillment based on what Amazon. You've got increased ability to 3D printing at mass scale to where you're really creating product on demand. Like it's going to be interesting around how does that play into how do you choose and who chooses, right? I may not be choosing what's the best fishing lure versus my AI avatar of sorts of is going to do that. Or maybe they'll start doing customer data on fishes to say this. Fish will tell Jason which ones they like most. But I think it's actually this is where it actually gets really fun. It's like, but the one thing that goes back to constant. We all go back to our specific roles. Have a great product. Try to know as much information as you possibly can to differentiate that. You're continuing to evolve, continue to change. Have that be part of what you do. That's the only constant. Which is like just even like looking and saying, and that's okay. negative at the end, but I'm just like, I struggle with one of our customers who's just literally being forced to say, you just go do what everyone else, your competitors do. That's the strategy. It just chafes at my bones. Like that's like we're saying like, okay, just follow everyone else. And I think that, yeah, maybe that's the right short-term answer, but it's not the right long-term answer. And I think that companies are have to, I think it could go back. Maybe it ushers into an era where individual craftsmanship of sorts, whatever that means, becomes more important again, which I think would be actually really exciting.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, we're about to wrap up here, so start thinking about your final takeaways, you guys. But I think that's a really good call out. And I guess the sort of final question to you, Kevin, before the takeaways is, do you see this broadly from a strategy standpoint as an opportunity for disruption and sort of new entrants? Or is it really the big players who are going to get all of the benefit here? Is it a winner take all situation, or can many people prosper? And any thoughts on
Yeah.
this sort of strategic vision there?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's room for both. I mean, I think it goes back to, and it's again, it's going back to preference. I mean, we joke about your Starbucks habit. Well, you mean there's a consistency for if you think about the evaluation for you, why you choose that experience versus the random coffee shop that's down the street. And we all have different values, and so I think there's in that sense there's a room for both, and there's room for Starbucks to continue to evolve and to create an experience that is both great product plus great experience. And and I think that it's just a question of like I think there's probably going to be dominant players. Again, goes back to my statement a little bit before around the Western perspective. I do get concerned about something outside of market forces choosing the right what wins and loses. Like that's the big risk that's always kind of present in this scenario. But I do think that maybe that there's a lot of really smart people that have kind of, again, a book that you and I have both recently read, where, people choose to do something because they're pursuing a financial outcome or this or that. And I think society would be happier if you actually do what you're more built to do or meant to do, whatever that, from whatever your worldview perspective is and what that comes from. So, I mean, I do think that there's going to have to be a place for both. And I hope that, we continue to kind of design and play in worlds where we go back to the basic beliefs of creativity and ingenuity and fun. I think we'll be a happier society for that. And I think companies will make more money in the long run doing that too versus completely doing. I mean, I like my Frederick Taylor, but there's room for something else in it too. So
No doubt. Yeah, I think if you can get to a world where quality of product really is the differentiator because all of the things are equalized, that'd be pretty amazing. I
or
think the
maybe
risk
you have all the world's rare earth minerals are in one spot. That might change the game a
that
little bit,
might
but
change it too. All right, so the final round here, final takeaways, Jason.
Maybe we should go start a company that does this distributed data
The
about
universal
people.
memory
You
layer.
got me
Okay.
got me thinking about that.
All right,
Like
fair enough.
the the OAuth version of all your data.
Okay, Kevin.
all right. So Jason is now going to be worthless for the rest of the day. He's usually on a Friday he's thinking about what he's doing over the weekend, but now he's thinking about what. It's good. I like it.
That's fine.
I just it's just fun. I mean, it's a fun. Again, I really believe in the optimistic view. It's a fun time to be around, and I think I think for all companies and including ours, I think the more you focus on, driving value through innovation and growth and top line versus focusing only on, just kind of, simplification across everything. I think ultimately you'll be more successful, which I think is kind of fun even about the models themselves. This new wave of technology companies that have evolved and really kind of been birthed over the last decade. It's just kind of fun to see what that is, and it makes me want to say, what's next, and how's that going to play out through that? And I think the more companies that we got to continue to have companies that are willing and firms and VC shops and PE shops that are willing to invest in Tame. I mean, OpenAI has been around actually for a lot long. I mean, for the most people, OpenAI has been around for 24 months. It's been around for a lot longer than that, and I think that's just, we need companies that can do that and invest in that.
No doubt. Yeah, I think for me, it's really that this is one of those moments when it's the very early burgeoning days of what will I think be the major differentiator for this technology that we've been talking about for a while, this context layer. Who owns the memory? I think you're going to see a lot of really strategic thinking across lots of really smart people and companies. And watching that play out, I think, is an amazing opportunity. So I'm going to be paying close attention to what these people are doing and how they're making moves in that space with that lens in particular. Well, if you're building this, CEO who's wrestling with it, we'd love to hear from you. Please visit us at the insights page at credera.com. And let's all, technologists, please get to a world where not everybody has their own data silo and we can finally get to a world where things can be better? What do you think, Jason? No? Okay. Well, anyway, again, thanks for listening today. Join us at the insights page at Credera.com.